was the sound that first caught her attention, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like the rustle of leaves in a breeze that didn't exist. Emma paused mid-step, her hiking boots sinking into the soft earth of the forest trail. The woods around her were eerily silent, save for that strange, murmuring sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that seemed to coil around her, tugging at the edges of her mind. She glanced over her shoulder, her breath shallow. The trail behind her was empty, the trees standing like silent sentinels in the fading afternoon light. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a prickling sensation crawling up her spine. She shook it off, chiding herself for being paranoid. She was alone in the woods, just like she'd wanted. No distractions, no noise, just her and nature. But as she turned back to the trail, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Emma had come to these woods to escape. The stress of her job, the noise of the city, the constant buzz of her phone, it had all become too much. She needed solitude, a place to clear her head. The forest had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe. But today it felt different. The air was heavier, the shadows deeper. Even the sunlight filtering through the canopy seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. She pressed on, shaking off the unease creeping into her chest. The trail wound deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, their gnarled roots twisting across the path like skeletal fingers. The whispering continued, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It slithered through the branches, curling around her like an unseen presence. She told herself it was just the wind, just the rustling of leaves. But deep down, she knew better. The silence between the whispers felt even more unsettling. It was too quiet, no chirping birds, no rustling critters in the underbrush, no distant hum of insects. The forest was alive, but it was holding its breath. Watching, then she saw it. Ahead, just off the trail, was a clearing she didn't remember from her previous hikes. It was unnatural, too perfectly round, as if something had carved it out of the dense woodland. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk twisted and blackened, as if scorched by some long-forgotten fire. The ground around it was bare, devoid of the usual undergrowth, and the air smelled faintly of ash and something else, something metallic, like blood. Emma hesitated. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to turn back. But curiosity, that stubborn, insistent force, pulled her forward, step by cautious step. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic rhythm against the eerie stillness of the forest. As she approached the tree, the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just one voice now, it was many, overlapping and intertwining, a cacophony of hushed tones that sent chills down her spine. The words were unintelligible, but the urgency in their voices was unmistakable. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the rough bark. The moment she made contact, the voices stopped. The silence was absolute, pressing in on her from all sides like an unseen weight. And then she heard it. A single clear voice whispering her name. Emma. Her breath hitched and she stumbled back, heart hammering against her ribs. The voice had been right beside her ear, as if someone were standing inches away. But there was no one there. The forest remained empty, unmoving, yet the air around her crackled with something unseen, something ancient. Then out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A flicker of shadow against the base of the tree. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head. A figure stood there, barely visible, as if woven from the darkness itself. It took shape. A tall, gaunt silhouette, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured in a shifting mass of shadow. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but she felt its gaze, heavy and suffocating. Her body screamed at her to run, but she was frozen, trapped in its stare. Then it moved. The figure took a step forward, and the ground beneath Emma's feet seemed to lurch. The tree's bark pulsed as if it were alive, and the whispers returned. Louder now, desperate, pleading. "Emma, run!" The voices shrieked in unison, breaking whatever spell had held her in place. She turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at her arms and legs. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The path twisted ahead, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't the way she had come. The trees loomed higher, their trunks closing in, the whispering now a deafening roar. She pushed forward, lungs burning, legs aching, until, she broke through the tree line. Stumbling onto the familiar gravel road where her car was parked, she gasped for air, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her keys. She could still hear the whispering, distant now, retreating back into the woods. But one voice remained, lingering in her ear like a breath against her skin. "See you soon, Emma." She yanked open the car door and threw herself inside, locking it behind her. With trembling hands, she started the engine and tore down the road, leaving the forest behind. But she knew that whatever had whispered her name, whatever had watched her from the shadows, it wasn't done with her yet. Emma stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was unmistakable. It was hers. But it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from the tree. She stared at the gnarled trunk, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The bark seemed to ripple, shifting and contorting as if alive. And then slowly, a face began to emerge. It was her face. The features were distorted, stretched and twisted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. But it was undeniably her. The eyes were hollow, the mouth frozen in a silent scream. Emma wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but her legs refused to obey. The face in the tree began to move, its lips parting as if to speak. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a perfect mimicry of her own. Emma finally found her voice, a strangled cry escaping her lips. She turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush without a thought for the trail. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees leaning closer, their branches clawing at her arms and face. The whispering returned, louder now, more urgent. She could hear her name being called from every direction, the voices overlapping and echoing in her mind. She didn't know how long she ran, only that her lungs were burning and her legs were on fire. Finally, she burst into a clearing, collapsing to her knees in the dirt. She looked up, expecting to see the familiar trailhead, the safety of her car, but instead she saw the oak tree. It was impossible. She had run in a straight line, away from the tree, but here it was, standing in the center of the clearing as if it had been waiting for her. The face was still there, its hollow eyes staring into hers. And then, slowly, it began to smile. Emma woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. She was lying on the forest floor, the first light of dawn filtering through the trees. The oak tree was gone, the clearing empty. She sat up, her head spinning, and looked around. The forest was quiet, peaceful. Had it all been a dream? She stood on shaky legs, brushing the dirt from her clothes. Her phone was in her pocket, the screen cracked but still functional. She checked the time, 6:12 a.m. She had been out here all night. Relief washed over her, followed by a lingering sense of unease. She needed to get out of these woods. As she made her way back to the trail, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The whispering was gone, but the memory of it lingered, a faint echo in the back of her mind. She reached the trailhead and climbed into her car, her hands trembling as she turned the key in the ignition. It wasn't until she was driving down the empty road that she noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the back seat. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and for a split second she saw it, a face twisted and distorted, staring back at her, and then it was gone. Emma gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The whispering continued, soft and insistent, as she drove faster and faster, desperate to escape. But deep down she knew the truth. She would never escape. The forest had claimed her.